welcome. I'm so thrilled so many people could join us today. I'm Amy Lerman, a professor of political science and public policy at UC Berkeley, and today's panel is hosted by the Jack Citrin Center for Public Opinion Research. The center was created in 2017 as a way to honor and extend the legacy of Professor Jack Citrin, a Berkeley faculty member of 50 years, a leading scholar and teacher of public opinion, and a friend, colleague, and mentor to so many of us in the discipline of political science. The Citrin Center conducts original polling, engages in cutting-edge research on public opinion, organizes conference and lectures to bring together top scholars, and supports research conducted by affiliated faculty members and graduate students. In addition, the center publicizes its research findings to create a broader awareness of the study of public opinion and to use public opinion to inform pressing and timely policy and political debates. It's my pleasure today to introduce a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to present their work on race and public opinion in order to help us better understand today in historical context. Professor David Brookman is joining me today to co-moderate this panel, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to him for introducing our panelists.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. So we have 4 panelists today, and we're just going to go in alphabetical order. Each panelist will get 15 minutes, and then at the end of the event, we'll have around 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. The way the Q&A will work, if you look in your Zoom window, along the bottom on the right, you should see something that says Q&A. You click that, you should be able to type in a question, and then you feel free to type those in whenever you want. And then at the end, we will start taking some of those questions live, and I'll direct them to some of the panelists. The panelists also can answer with a text response if they want. So without further ado, first up is Desmond Eng. Take it away. You're on mute.
All right.
There we go.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you everyone for having me. Thank you, Amy, David, and Jack for hosting this, and for everyone else for being here. I wanted to present some new research today that I think is informative of this current moment that we're having regarding race and policing and public policy. This is joint work with John Tebbs, who's also at Harvard, and examines civic responses to police violence. So in recent years, as we've all seen, high-profile police killings have generated significant media attention and controversy. Killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, Daniel Pruitt, among others. But these events, I think it's important to note, tie into a very long history of acts of police violence in America. So in 2014, I know this feels like an eon ago, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. In 1991-92, we had sort of the Rodney King beating and then the subsequent riots. And in 1965, Marquette Frye was assaulted by officers leading to the Watts riots in LA. And I want to note that these landmark events, obviously very salient, but they comprise a really small fraction of the 1,000 police killings that occur each year in the United States. The vast majority of these incidents receive little local, much less national media attention. So all of this is to emphasize the extent to which acts of police violence are not new. And in fact, police violence is a very well-established part of the American law enforcement system. That said, there's very little evidence, empirical evidence about the social or political consequences of acts of police violence on local communities. And in fact, you could kind of imagine that these effects could go in either direction. They're sort of theoretically ambiguous. So, recent events suggest that acts of police violence might catalyze some of these really large-scale social or political movements. We've seen Black Lives Matter protests, nationwide, essentially, the NBA player boycott, etc. And there's also research, some of which is by our panelists here, by Hannah and Angela, showing that marginalized groups might respond or might be mobilized by injustice, whether that's criminal justice contact or anti-immigrant rhetoric. Or as well as by Omar showing, these large-scale political protests and riots might have some political ramifications causing public opinion to change, etc. On the other hand, police violence might destroy people's trust in institutions, right? It can make you question your place in society, question the legitimacy of government, leading to legal cynicism, disengagement, system avoidance, etc. Right? And so Amy Lerman, as well as Vesla Weaver, Ariel White at MIT, there's a lot of evidence showing that there might be really large demobilizing effects for coming in contact with the criminal justice system, whether that's yourself, whether that's one of your family members or one of your friends. In my own work, I look at the impacts of police killings on nearby students, and I find that Black and Hispanic students are dropping out of school because of police killings in such a way that you might expect perhaps Black and Hispanic voters or minority voters might be dropping out of the electoral process because of these incidents as well. And so again, it's sort of unclear which direction these effects even go in. You could imagine people are sort of going to respond to police killings by exercising their voice. You could also imagine that that's leading them to disengage or exit from political institutions. This paper hopes to estimate some of this causal impacts. Empirically, what can we say about what happens to local political participation after a police killing? And so to do that, just to give you a high-level overview, we're going to be looking in Los Angeles County, where we have very detailed registration data for the 2002 to 2010 general elections. So we have registration and vote counts at really fine geographic levels, specifically the census block level. And this is going to be disaggregated by race, age, etc. And so we'll merge this registration data with highly detailed incident level information for all police killings that occurred in LA County over the same time period. And so LA experiences more police killings than any other county in the nation. Even on a per capita basis, it's a higher rate of being killed by police in LA than in Chicago or New York, etc. And so over this time period, this 8-year period, there were 330 police killings. There's about 40 a year in Los Angeles. And for each of these incidents, we have really detailed information about what happened. And so just briefly going to econ speak, how do we measure changes in participation due to police killing? What we're going to do is leverage something called a difference-to-differences design. And essentially all this is we're going to say, what happens to political participation after police killing in the blocks where these killings occur, relative to what happens to participation such as registration of votes in adjacent blocks, so areas very close to where the police killing occurred that were in the same neighborhood, but slightly further away. Just to give you a sense of what this setting looks like for those of you who are unfamiliar. So LA County, we have all this registration data. It's going to be aggregated to about 70,000 census blocks. So census blocks are very small geographic areas. They measure about 0.1 square miles each. And so it literally corresponds to a street block in most cases. LA is a very sort of minority heavy area in that about 50% of individuals are either Hispanic, Black, or Asian. About 50% of individuals are white. It's also liberal leaning. And so 50% of registrants are Democratic relative to about a quarter of registrants who are registered Republican. Now, again, what we're going to do is we're going to merge this information on census blocks and voter registration and voting over time with very detailed information about officer-involved killings that occurred in LA County over the same time period. And so this information comes from hand-coding district attorney incident reports. Every time a police shoots somebody in LA, the district attorney writes a description of what happened. We've gone through that information and compiled information about the race of the person that was killed, the incident, the contextual factors around the incident. And so you'll see, and this is consistent with national statistics, minorities, specifically Blacks and Hispanics, will be overrepresented in terms of the likelihood of being killed by police and likelihood of showing up in this data. What's really notable is that we've also searched for whether or not these incidents were covered in local newspapers, whether there was some mention of this event in local newspapers, including the LA Times, but also 5 other smaller newspapers. And we find that 82% of these police killings were unmentioned in local newspapers. Okay, so I think this is very important contextual information in the sense that obviously what we've seen nationwide, these events comprise just a really, really small handful of all the police killings that occur in the United States. It's just really just the tip of the iceberg, those incidents that are covered in media. That being said, a lot of these incidents that we're finding are not covered in local newspapers, sound not dissimilar from those events that we have seen in national media. So 16% of police killings involved killing of somebody that was completely unarmed. 27% of incidents involved somebody that was armed with a weapon, but it wasn't a gun. And about 50 to 60% of incidents involve somebody that was armed with a gun or a replica gun or a BB gun, etc. Okay? And again, this is very consistent with national statistics in which 50 to 60% of police killings involve somebody that was armed. The remainder are people that, might be completely unarmed. They might have some weapon that's perhaps less deadly. What's also consistent with national statistics is that 0 across these 330 officer-involved killings, none of these incidents resulted in charges pressed against involved officers. Police officers in the United States are given just very wide latitude in determining when and how much force to use. All right. And so because most of these events are unreported, we're going to exploit a lot of the spatial variation in terms of how close does a person live to where these killings occur. And that allows us to identify these effects on political participation. So here's just an example, a police killing of a man named Charlie Wilson in July 2007. Here's this dark gray block represents the census block where he was killed. These other areas in white are other blocks in the same census block group, same neighborhood, if you will, that were in this, again, in a similar area, but where the killing didn't occur. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare voting trends in this dark gray area before and after the police killing to voting trends in these white areas around where that incident occurred. Okay? And this is similar to what I do in my paper where I examine academic effects, and I find that there are these very highly localized academic effects where students that live right next door to a police killing respond very differently from students that live even slightly further away. And some of this is correlated, obviously, with the fact that most of these events are not reported in local newspapers, such that you really have to be there or have seen the incident to even know what happened. All right. So getting to our effects on registration, here we're looking at changes, again, in registration counts at the block level before and after police killing. So left of this red line are trends in registration prior to a police killing, right is trends in registration after a police killing. You're going to see that police killings lead to significant increases in registrations. Again, it's something like 2 to 3 registration counts, but blocks are such small areas that this accounts for about a 4 to 6% increase in registration. Okay. In other analysis, you can see that these gains in registration persist for a very long time. Now, looking at effects on vote counts, you're also going to see a significant but short-lived increase in vote counts by about 5%. And these effects are robust to a number of different specifications. It's important to note that these effects mask a lot of heterogeneity. What we mean by that is that different people are responding very differently. Some people are responding very strongly, and some people are responding not at all. And so when we unpack this by race, the race of the voter, what we find is that all of these effects on voter registration and vote counts are coming from Black and Hispanic voters. In other analysis, we find that this is really coming from new and young voters as well as liberals. What we see here in this graph that's obvious is that Black and Hispanics are responding very strongly in terms of the political participation. They're more likely to engage with the political process following a police killing, whereas whites and Asians are actually, there's no change among these groups. Okay? And so what drives these gains in participation? Why are people voting more? To get to this question, we examine support for referenda that proposed weakening criminal penalties for low-level offenders. So this is during the period of the Three Strikes Law, which is still somewhat ongoing. And so from 2004 to 2008, there were 2 propositions that proposed softening criminal penalties for low-level offenders. We compare the change from 2004 to 2008 in support for these propositions in census blocks where police killings occurred during this period against census blocks in the same neighborhood where the killing did not occur. And what we find is that local support for criminal justice reform increases after these police killings occur in these blocks where they occurred, whereas there's actually no change in areas that are further away. Okay, so it suggests that these police killings, these increases in mobilization are in support of criminal justice reform. We can also look at differential effects based on the weapon that the person who was killed was armed with. And so here we're looking at differential effects on registration and votes, comparing effects for police killings of individuals who are unarmed against police killings of individuals who had a knife or a gun. And what we find is that the largest effects of police killings, most of these effects of police killings, are coming through these police killings of unarmed individuals, right? These are individuals that you might expect were the least likely to pose a threat to the community. These are incidents in which you might think police actions were the most excessive. And so I think this really suggests that a lot of these gains in participation are coming through these perceptions of injustice, these perceptions of government misconduct, this desire to reform the criminal justice system. And so just to summarize, what we're finding is these communities are responding to police violence, specifically these minority individuals, younger individuals, liberals. They're responding to police violence by engaging with the political system more. They're voicing their concerns around police killings, and they're increasing their support for criminal justice reform. And I think this is, again, consistent with that first theory that we had, in which we might think that people are mobilized by injustice. And so in the current context, I think these local responses are very reflective of the same sentiments that we're seeing nationally with regards to these Black Lives Matter movements, but on a much smaller scale. And I think this is a really important realization. This final takeaway I want to give you guys is obviously we're having this national reckoning now, but a lot of these minority communities have been dealing with issues of police violence for decades. You can go back to the Turner Report of 1965, and you'll see the same concerns that we expressed then as we see now expressed through these Black Lives Matter protests and other forums. And these communities, based on these results, have been trying to do something about these incidents. They've been trying to mobilize, trying to vote for a really long time. But for whatever reason, these efforts have just gone unseen and unheard by the larger public until very recently. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that. Great talk again. And thank you so much for staying within the 15 minutes as well. I know that's hard to do for such an ambitious research project. I think next in alphabetical order is Angela Ocampo. So we'll turn it over to her. And just as a reminder, you can put your Q&A in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end. All right, Angela, take it away.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes, but your slides are not coming up.
Okay, let me see. One second, they just were paused for some reason. Okay. Hopefully this works.
Yep. Oh, you could see them, but now it's.
Yep. All right. 1 second. I'm gonna have to open them with preview. I think I'm having the same issue as Hannah earlier. Sorry. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you all so much for inviting me, Amy, David, and Jack. I'm really excited to be here and to be sharing with you all part of my book project. So I'm going to try to keep this under 15 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. But as I'm mentioning, this is part of a larger book project where I'm really interested in looking at perceived belonging and perceived lack of belonging among Latinos. So I'm going to be drawing from several chapters of my book, and I'm going to be giving you some evidence as to how this relates to political engagement among Latinos. And so, you know, I want to begin here and kind of ground this in historical context and really sort of to speak to the theme of our conversation today, and which is to say that exclusion of Latinos in this country has taken many different forms. It's been formal, right, as we can sort of think of the strict exclusion that Latinos in different parts of the country have faced historically, but we also see more in present times, right, different ways in which Latinos get excluded, right, through messaging that comes from elites, from peers, from policies that are passed that impact their community. And so, you know, we can wonder, right, like, how are these messages that Latinos receiving on a day-to-day basis, how do they affect their perceptions of belonging and inclusion in US society? Do these contradictory political messages that they're getting, right, from political parties, right, in the sense that there's such an important voting group, for example, in the upcoming election, and the contrary, a lot of the rhetoric that has come from a lot of elected officials, right? How do these contradictory messages impact their perceptions of belonging? And following this, what are the political ramifications of varying perceptions of belonging or lack of belonging to society for Latinos? So these are, you know, the overarching questions that my book is looking at. So before I continue, I want to sort of take a pause and define a little bit what I mean by belonging to US society. So belonging in sort of the sheer sense is acceptance as a member of part of some entity or a group. And perceived belonging in this project really considers, right, the perception that one is part of US society, that one is a member, and the perception that one's membership is recognized and valued by others. So it has both this internal and external component. So in thinking about why belonging and perceived belonging might matter for politics, right? Why am I making this the case, and why should we even be talking about belonging? Given that, right, there's so much exclusionary messages Latinos are getting. So belonging as a concept has received little attention in political science. So some scholars have looked at how belonging in the polity does lead to much more inclusive, has led to support for more inclusive policies, for example. But we know from work in psychology and sociology and social psychology that the need and desire to belong to different entities is an innate human emotion and feeling. So it's just as important as any other needs that humans have, including the need for food, the need for shelter. So we know that it greatly matters. And we also have evidence that perceived belonging and social inclusion is really important for individual outcomes and group outcomes. So increased perceptions of belonging in social settings promote self-esteem, educational achievement, and belonging has also been found to lead to greater motivation among individuals who feel like they belong to a group, right? They're much more likely to behave in relation to things of their group and whatever this group entity may be. So I should kind of add here that the way in which belonging has been studied in these other disciplines is belonging in different group settings, whether they are small group activities or in a classroom setting or in a school setting, or even much more sort of larger groups. So what I argue in my book is that this concept and this idea of perceived belonging is particularly tied to the political realities of racial and ethnic minorities. And it is important because membership to broader US society is not inherent and is not a given for racial and ethnic minorities. So their sense of membership and their sense of belonging has been historically questioned and continues to be questioned. And as a result of this, racial and ethnic minorities have had centuries-long struggles and battles, right, to make claims of membership and belonging that continue well into today. In particular, I argue that Latinos encompass a group of members who whose members have been historically racialized. And they continue to be perceived and treated as outsiders, regardless of national origin, regardless of citizenship, and or nativity status. So I argue that this concept of perceived social inclusion is a unique and independent predictor of political attitudes and behaviors for Latinos, and one that we haven't given much attention to, but I argue is critically important. So what I'm going to show you today is data just from 3 sources, and I'm going to show you a little bit of data from surveys, some experiments, and some qualitative data that I think it's really important and helps us understand what I mean by perceptions of belonging or lack of belonging. So I'm drawing from the 2016 Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, also the 2017 Research Now SSI National Politics and Policy Study, and a 2020 Turk Prime Belonging and Politics survey that I conducted over the summer. So how do I measure social inclusion? So I developed these items heavily relying and borrowing from the psychology literature on the need to belong, and also literature in social identity theory, in particular that looks at status of group members and how group members understand their standing in a given group. And so the measures that I use more or less in the project will tap into these both components that I mentioned about perceived belonging and inclusion. So the internal, to tap into the internal, I asked respondents, how much do you believe that you belong in U.S. society? How much do you believe that you're an insider or outsider? So I vary that in the wording. And to tap into the external component, I asked respondents, how much do you believe that others in your society value you? And how much do you believe that you're accepted, rejected, and or included or excluded by others in your society who are not like you? So these, throughout all of the surveys that I've conducted, in addition to those 3 that I mentioned earlier, are the wording that I use to tap into perceptions of social inclusion or exclusion. So before I delve into the quantitative results and the empirical results, I want to just draw your attention to 2 quotes from some of my respondents and some of the open-endeds that I have conducted. And I'm going to begin here with this 37-year-old from San Antonio who responded when I asked them if they could recall a moment when they felt included or accepted, right? What was that moment like and how did they feel, right? If they could just describe that moment. So this 37-year-old tells me, right, that this is one particular moment that really sticks out to them. So they said, I was at a parade for the Battle of Flowers. It's a Texas tradition, one that I haven't been part of in a while. It hit me with nostalgia of past times and it made me proud to be a Texan. I was overcome with state pride and I had a great time seeing Mexican Americans being celebrated the way I did that day with all the bands and culture shown that day. It was good to see my people being shown off in a good light. All right, so here, this particular person is talking about how much representation and how much seeing their culture, their identity being portrayed in a positive light meant for them, and how much this informed their sense of belonging, right? It validated their presence in this country. On the other hand, we can think of the 50-year-old man from Atlanta, Georgia, who responded this to my question, or to the question about if they could recall a moment when they felt excluded, right? And what was that moment like, and how did they feel, and what happened? So he said, I work in a well-known pizza parlor chain. One day I had a call from a customer asking for the manager. I took the call and listened patiently to the customer complaint. As I didn't agree with him, he started cursing and yelling, to which I told him I was to hang up on him. When he then came with the following question, do you even own a green card? I told him that unfortunately that wasn't his business, and he replied, of course it is my business. I work for ICE, and I'm on my way to arrest you. I know that this government has promoted racism and hatred within its supporters, but in 19 years of living in this wonderful country, I hadn't felt more excluded than that day. So here, he's talking about this one particular scenario, right, where this person, without even knowing who really, whether or not, right, he was documented or not, immediately starts questioning him, right, questioning his presence, questioning whether or not he could even, be in this country, and thus making him feel excluded, right, and not part of U.S. society. So these are just 2 of the many examples that I find in my research, right, these sort of very different perceptions of belonging among Latinos. But can these messages, right, and these signals that I talk about, right, can these actually shift perceptions of inclusion and exclusion? So to really assess that, I conduct a survey experiment to tease out and get a sense of whether or not the cues and the messaging that Latinos are getting constantly, politically and socially, affect their sense of belonging. So I present this through a fictional story, through a New York Times article, and this experiment was fielded on a sample Research Now SSI. So just to give you kind of a quick overview of what the treatment looked like, is, it looks like a New York Times article, and then sort of they read about a particular story, right, that was either about supporting the funding for Latino History Museum or opposing the funding for a Latino History Museum. Here is a summary of what the treatment conditions look like. And so in the control condition, respondents just see a regular technology kind of by Google. Again, in the support condition, they see a strong signal that socially and politically a Latino History Museum is being advocated for. And it's a recognition, if you will, of Latino contributions to America. In the opposition condition, respondents are shown sort of the opposite, a cue where socially and politically a Latino History Museum is not, is not supported. And in the non-ethnic condition, respondents see, as opposed to an ethnic specific and Latino specific museum, they see a condition of support just for an American museum. So what I find here is that actually respondents who are randomly assigned to the opposition, to the opposed condition, report lower perceptions of belonging in the social inclusion scale of those 4 items that I showed you earlier. And they're significantly much more likely to report lower perceptions of belonging compared to those who were assigned to that control condition, right? So I find that these cues are having an impact, and Latinos are responding to these messages that they're getting, particularly to the ones that are negative and to the ones that signal to them that their membership is not valued and recognized. But why does this matter, right? Does belonging matter for political engagement at all? Like, should we actually care that these perceptions can be manipulated and can be moved? So here I just show you some results from the relationship between social inclusion and validated turnout in 2016. And so here I'm just showing you changes in predicted probability of having voted, and this is for each one of the covariates while holding every other covariate at their means. And so here we can see, more or less the impact of social inclusion on validated turnout. I want to, sort of jump really quickly here, because I think these are really important and interesting results, right? So like, okay, you've shown us that there are some associations and that these correlations seem to hold, right? It seems like these perceptions of social inclusion matter and have an impact, right, for validated turnout. But can we get some more additional causal leverage here, right? So in order to really tease out and further tease out whether or not inclusion or exclusion matter for political behavior, I conduct an experiment where I situationally induced inclusion or exclusion through a reliving task. And so these have been done by political psychologists in the sense of trying to induce certain types of emotions. So what I do here is very similar to one of those exercises. I ask respondents to tell me in a few sentences whether or not to describe a particular scenario where they were made to feel as if they belong or didn't belong. And then they're asked to take a few minutes and to write several sentences or paragraph or more about how they felt. And so right after this, then I assess their likelihood of participating in a variety of different activities in the next 12 months, political activities. And one of the ones that was really sort of striking, right, is that respondents that were assigned to the exclusion or rejection induction exercise were significantly less likely to report that they had any interest in participating in the 2012 election, right? Compared to those that were assigned to a control induction exercise where they were just told to think about US society in general. So just to conclude and kind of wrap up, I've said, and what I talk about in my book, that scholars of American politics and race and ethnicity have largely overlooked an important psychological construct that I really think, and that I've tried to make the case that is really at the core of how we understand the way in which racial and ethnic minorities behave politically and how they understand their standing in US society. So perceptions of social inclusion greatly matter for political outcomes among Latinos. And as I've made the case, because membership and inclusion is not inherent, and also cues and messages have a substantial impact on their perceived exclusion, right? And these messages can shift these perceptions and do shift these perceptions. Moreover, I find that these perceptions of inclusion or exclusion have attitudinal behavioral ramifications, right? Beyond even a correlational setting. And I think what this makes us really sort of question and kind of pause and really think about, right, is the conventional wisdom that threat is a great mobilizer for Latinos, because it might be the case, right, that threat could also lead to decreased perceptions of belonging, right? It can lead to perceived exclusion. And if that's the case, then that is going to lead to demobilization. So that is all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Next up, we have Hannah Walker.
Thank you so much, David, and to the other organizers of this panel for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you guys a little bit about my book, Mobilized by Injustice, which examines the impact of experiences with the criminal justice system on political attitudes and behaviors. And then I also hope to have a couple of minutes to talk to you about some ongoing projects that follow from the book. So Dina is an activist in the city of Seattle who I met while she was working on a campaign to protest the expansion of a juvenile detention center located in the city's historic Black neighborhood. And Dina became politicized by watching her brother negotiate the system, watching him experience repeated short stints in jail and navigating the perils associated with reentry. As a consequence of watching him go through these experiences, her ideas about how the system works began to change, and she began to view it as a force for group-based inequality and as not designed to protect people like her, saying to me, for me and for a lot of people who come from poor communities of color, safety is not a thing that exists right now. For those of us who are impacted by prisons, we see every day our safety being taken away. For every family member I lose, I'm less safe. That's the thing that's real for people whose communities are over-policed. That's the thing that's real for people whose families are kidnapped by the state. And so as she concluded that the system is a force for group-based inequality, this set of conclusions prompted her to become active in efforts to resist the expansion of the detention center. And Dina's story is not unique, but is recognizable to activists across the country who are organizing against police brutality and against what they see as excessive criminal justice practices. Minorities and the poor are disproportionately likely to have involuntary interactions with the criminal justice system, and policing tactics that are designed to preempt crime make the threat of contact a very real and frequent possibility for individuals who are viewed as potentially criminal based on where they live or how they look and dress. And for every individual who's stopped, arrested, or incarcerated, there's a network of additional folks who, by virtue of their relational connection, witness the criminal justice system in action. And I call this proximal contact. And like Dina, individuals with proximal contact very often learn civic lessons by watching their loved ones negotiate the system. And so researchers demonstrate that all types of contact, both personal and proximal, erode trust in government and diminish the likelihood of voting. And scholars argue that individuals become demobilized and withdraw from politics because the system sends the message to custodial citizens and their families that their negative experiences are a result of their own poor choices. Indeed, the negative consequences of contact are so profound that it leads Lerman and Weaver to write that the racial socialization of the criminal justice system holds little potential for resistance because it regularly conveys to its wards that their fates were due to their choices alone. And existing research has less to offer in terms of thinking about the activism of people like Dina in Seattle, Ferguson, Baltimore, and in cities across the country at this current political moment. And so this book begins by asking the question, under what conditions do individuals become politically mobilized by experiences with the criminal justice system, and under what conditions do they become demobilized? And I further examine how these outcomes may vary among whites, Blacks, and Latinos. And so today, in today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing in on proximal contact, and I'm also going to be focusing in on that path from proximal contact towards political mobilization. So following from Dina's narrative and the other narratives shared with me by activists on the street, I argue that individuals become mobilized when, instead of internalizing their negative experiences as a result of their own poor choices or the personal failings of a loved one, they instead externalize those experiences, connecting them to a larger set of institutional biases that they believe unfairly target them and people like them on the basis of race, ethnicity, class, gender, or other group-based identifiers. Now, I further argue that we should anticipate that mobilization that is a consequence of negative experiences with the criminal justice system should be expected to manifest outside the ballot box, that voting is really the wrong place to look for mobilization, although I'll confess that Desmond's presentation earlier is causing me to rethink that a little bit. But we should expect it to manifest in other types of activities and things like protesting and signing petitions. And this is true for several reasons, but chief among them is that an eroded sense of trust in government that develops from involuntary experiences with the criminal justice system may likewise be accompanied by a declining belief in the efficacy of elections, even as a newly politicized consciousness compels participation outside of formal politics. Now, throughout the course of the book, I draw on 5 different surveys to test various aspects of my theory, but today what I'd like to do is walk you through the findings derived from just 2 of them. The National Crime and Politics Survey, which is an original survey collected especially for this project and was collected in 2013, includes a variety of measures of contact as well as evaluations of community policing, which I use to measure perceptions of injustice. And then the 2016 ANES, which unfortunately doesn't include corollary measures of perceptions of injustice, but nevertheless offers the ability to corroborate some of those findings that are derived from the NCPS. And so in the ANES, I draw on perceived discrimination to proxy for perceptions of injustice. I also draw on 59 in-depth interviews with activists, advocates, and community members impacted by the criminal justice system. And these interviews are particularly useful for uncovering the role of race in structuring both contact and the types of narratives that individuals access to make sense of their criminal justice experiences. So the first thing that I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the relationship between contact and perceptions of injustice. And so that's what this graph is showing you. It's showing you the impact of proximal contact on perceptions of injustice in the NCPS in the top row and on perceived discrimination in the ANES on the bottom row. The other piece of information that I've included on this graph is percentages of individuals who report having proximal contact. And so we can see in the total sample in the NCPS, 43% of individuals indicate that they have had proximal contact. And then in the ANES, which asks people about instances of proximal contact in the 12 months prior to the survey, to the time that the survey was fielded, 19% of individuals indicated that they had contact. So we can also see that proximal contact is positively associated with perceptions of injustice across all subgroups. However, we can also see that race structures these relationships, right? Black Americans are both more likely to report that they have had contact than are their white counterparts, and the size of the impact of contact on perceptions of injustice is greater than it is for their white counterparts. Latinos fall somewhere between their white and Black counterparts, both in terms of the extent to which they report contact and in terms of the extent to which they interpret their experiences through the lens of injustice. But race also structures the narratives that people draw on to make sense of their experiences with the criminal justice system. So white Americans primarily draw on class-based narratives to make sense of their own experiences, pointing and honing in particular on the extent to which they view the system as profit-driven. And so it's perhaps not surprising that white Americans draw on class-based narratives in order to make sense of their experience, their own individual experiences. But what sets their experiences apart from people of color is the extent to which they centralize class to explain other types of unequal criminal justice outcomes. So Jared is a really good example. He has proximal contact because his romantic partner became involved in the criminal legal system. And in talking about that experience, he references things like she's poor, she wasn't able to hire a lawyer, and these sorts of things. But when pressed and asked to explain, to think about and explain racial differences in the criminal justice system, he said, it has more to do with social class than anything else. I think in terms of SES, white people generally have it better off than African-American people do, which does something to explain why the criminal justice system is weighted that way. In contrast, Black Americans centralize, or they place race at the center of their narratives. And so that does not mean that their narratives are not also class-based, but it means that race is at the center and they connect their experiences and they connect the criminal justice system backwards to previous iterations of racial control. And so Tanya is quite a good example. Her father was incarcerated while she was growing up. And in talking about her experience, her realization that he was caught up in an unjust system, she said, I started recognizing the economics of the system, realizing, you know, that's free labor, people working for 30 cents an hour. We were slaves before, you know, why not be slaves now? They're still making bank off of us. Latinos, for their part, when thinking about the criminal justice system, their relationship to the criminal justice system, and the ways in which they have unique experiences with the system, apart from, above and beyond their status as people of color, really revolves around immigration and the sort of extent to which the threat of punitive immigration policy is made real through the presence of law enforcement on the street. So David is a good example. He's an advocate from Los Angeles in his mid-20s. And in speaking about the way that he thinks about law enforcement, he begins by talking about his community. And he says, around the community where I lived, a lot of parents were undocumented. So they were always in fear of ICE or immigration or police to come around. In that area, it was like Latino immigrants against politics, against ICE coming in and arresting people and deporting them. I wanted to help my mom get papers, but I also wanted to help my dad not get deported or not get arrested. So again, the conversation centers around punitive immigration policy, but the punitive nature of that policy is really made real in people's lives by the presence of law enforcement on the streets and in the communities where they live. Now, I've argued that individuals become mobilized when they connect their experiences to a larger set of institutional biases, when they view their experiences through the lens of injustice. But I've also argued that we should expect mobilization that arises from these experiences to manifest in activities other than voting. So what this graph is showing us is it's showing us the average marginal effects of proximal contact and perceptions of injustice and discrimination on voter registration and having voted in the NTPS in red and the ANES in blue. And so what we can see is that in both of these surveys, neither of these variables are related to voter registration or having voted, with the exception that in the ANES, perceived discrimination is negatively associated with voting. Instead, we should expect mobilization to manifest itself in other types of political activities. And so here I'm measuring non-voting political participation using an index of participation items that includes things like having attended a protest, signed a petition, and so forth. And so we're looking at the impact of proximal contact and injustice and discrimination on non-voting participation. And here we can see that both variables across both data sets are positively associated with participation. But this isn't really what we want to know. What we want to know is the extent to which perceptions of injustice underlie the positive relationship that we're observing between proximal contact and participation outcomes. We want to know how proximal contact performs in the absence of injustice, where the expectation here is that absent a sense of injustice, proximal contact should either be not related or should be negatively related to participation. So in order to assess this, I employ a moderation analysis and I interact proximal contact with perceptions of injustice. The results of that analysis are here with injustice and discrimination on the x-axis. And we can see, we see a set of findings that are in keeping with expectations, where a proximal contact is not related to participation in the absence of injustice. It's not until we see contact combined with injustice that we observe that positive relationship with participation. All right, to sum up where we've been, I began with the question, under what conditions are individuals mobilized by their experiences with the criminal justice system, and under what conditions are they demobilized? And today I focused in on proximal contact, and I argued and offered evidence to suggest that individuals become mobilized when they view their experiences through the lens of justice and connect those experiences to a larger set of institutional biases and that target them on the base, not on the basis of what they've done, but on the basis of who they are. I've offered that, that the primary role for race is in structuring the likelihood of contact, the nature of contact, and the types of narratives that individuals have available to them to make sense of their experiences and to arrive at a sense of injustice. But when individuals arrive at a sense of injustice, the mobilizing effect of those perceptions extend across racial subgroups. And so the racial inquiry that I explicitly undertake in this project lays the groundwork for the Black Lives Matter movement and lays the groundwork for future research on the Black Lives Matter movement and the myriad of allied groups who lead the contemporary movement for civil and human rights. And by extension, the political implications of this is that the criminal justice system creates the possibility for a multiracial coalition to contest its legitimacy, and discontent with punitive policy among custodial citizens and their loved ones is potential political power. And so with that, I want to just take a quick moment to tell you about a project that I'm developing with my several collaborators, where we endeavor to assess whether and how ex-offenders who nevertheless may be eligible to vote can be mobilized to register and ultimately vote. And so we've conducted a series of pilot studies in North Carolina that took place between January and June of 2020. And we're about to go in the field with a scaled up version in North Carolina and Texas this week. So I see David's face here, so I'm going to quickly run through I'll quickly just move ahead to sort of what these series of pilot experiments look like iteratively. We started out with a basic letter and registration package. We've added on a few other treatments that we're testing, but ultimately what we've concluded is that we think that the real thing that's doing work that we've observed is just telling people that who may have felony convictions that they may nevertheless be eligible to vote, and then providing them the resources to be able to get registered. And so we're going to be unpacking those treatments in a field experiment that's about to go into the field in the next couple of days. And so with that, I'll sign off. I'll hand it over to David and Omar, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the book or the field experiments in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. And it's great when the papers on the panel can talk to each other, which that definitely did. And yeah, last but not least, we'll turn it over to Omar. Omar, you have 15 minutes. And if you're talking, then you're muted.
I just wanted to say it's a real pleasure to be on this panel, a real honor to be in conversation with these other panelists, and also to thank Amy and David and the Citrin Center. So I'm going to be talking primarily about a paper that was recently published and a little bit of new work for a book project. The work looks at, in particular, kind of two debates that were happening, one within the Black community and one within political science. So I want to start with that debate within the Black community, where what we see in the 1960s is a debate that's happening really between, in sort of simple terms, integrationists and nationalists. On the right here is Bayard Rustin, a really important influence on Martin Luther King. And Rustin was a kind of a master organizer he at one point in an essay wrote that, one of the key challenges for African Americans is that they represent 10% of the US population in the 1960s. So neither the civil rights movement nor the country's 20 million Black people can win political power alone. They need allies. The future of the Negro struggle depends on whether the contradictions of this society can be resolved by a coalition of progressive forces, right? So this is this very pragmatic sense of, in a majoritarian system, it's really essential to have a coalition. Ella Baker, also a really important organizer, also an advocate for working within the system, but very much with a kind of a grassroots model. She, one of her most famous quotes is, "My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders." So that's kind of a within the system, coalitional organization, grassroots activism kind of model. And another important figure in these debates is Stokely Carmichael. Here again, a colleague and protege at one point of Martin Luther King, also remarkably a protege of Bayard Rustin, and has this striking kind of intellectual journey where he goes from being a committed pacifist to arguing for both Black power and a kind of conditional case for violence and self-defense. And so he, at one point in a speech at Berkeley, says, "The only time I hear people talk about nonviolence is when Black people move to defend themselves against white people. Black people have already been nonviolent for too many years." Similarly, UCLA professor Angela Davis, who grew up in Birmingham, in an interview talked about her experience having actually family friends bombed in Birmingham, and that when asked about violence said, because of the way the society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect there are going to be explosions. In this case, she's talking about violent resistance to white supremacy. So there's this active debate about what kinds of tactics are going to be most effective for advancing the Black freedom struggle. And in a kind of within the academic community, there's a debate about kind of elites versus pluralists and their influence on politics. And here, this is a debate also that could be situated within Berkeley. We have folks who show convincingly, like Gabriel Lenz, that elites dominate politics. There's this quote I like from Gillens and Page: "Mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence. They look across many issues and they find marginal groups just have very little voice." On the other side, we've got folks who argue for a more pluralistic sense of American democracy. Here, also in the Berkeley camp, oppositional counterpublics are critical sites for the emergence of non-elite influence on mass opinion. That's Taeku Lee. And that's sort of making a case that there is a kind of bottom-up effect. And I want to sort of see to what degree we can think both about protest tactics and about to what degree is there, do elites dominate, or is a pluralistic model better for explaining American politics? And I want to bring both of those debates to some public opinion data where we've got a puzzle, right? So what we've got here is the x-axis is time between 1950 and 1980. The y-axis is percent saying something is the most important problem. And you can see it's been categorized into four things: foreign affairs, economy, social control, and civil rights. And what's interesting is that on civil rights, it sort of stays low, and then spikes in 1963 and 1964, and then drops quite quickly. And this issue of social control, which is kind of a composite of things like crime and riots, goes up in the 60s, late 60s, and then drops in the early 70s. And so if you've got an elite model, it's hard to explain the rise in civil rights, right? I mean, one of the stories is that it's about campaigns. These dotted lines are presidential campaigns. We see civil rights declining as we go into a presidential campaign. We see civil rights flat as we go into the 68 presidential campaign. So it's not obvious that presidential campaigns are driving civil rights. And conversely, and similarly, this issue of social controls, relatively flat or declining around the 68 campaign. So it's not obviously elites that are driving that issue, at least not alone. And if our issue is kind of a bottom-up story, well, how do we explain the difference between sort of civil rights and social control? What explains these kind of different kinds of concerns in the mass public's mind? And to be clear, in 1960, the public is 90% white. So we're really talking about white public opinion here. So I have a theory. I'm just going to go very quickly through this and it builds on other work in the kind of social movement literature, that media are really a key actor here, that protests are helping to drive media attention. and that media favor elite narratives, but also seek things like profits and dramatic stories. So you could imagine something like a scandal, which might be bad for an elite member of society, but good for selling papers. And that, echoing the language of the 1960s activists, people are staging protests to dramatize injustice. So they literally are using kind of theatrical language to explain how they are taking the brutality and the injustice of Jim Crow and segregation and revealing it to the national audience and to the world. And that they're doing that, through the media. It's important to keep in mind here that almost nobody directly observes the protest. And so it's through the media that these small morality plays, an image, a video clip does a lot to shape public perceptions. And importantly, kind of in my work in conversation with others in this protest movement, that we may expect differential effects of nonviolent and violent tactics by protesters. So that is what I'm calling agenda seeding. Agenda setting is something that the media can do to kind of shape what people are thinking about. Agenda seeding is what subordinates can do to kind of nudge the media to cover their concerns, elevate their interest in the broader public discourse. Put in a kind of diagram, we can imagine you've got activists who are trying to figure out how to elevate concerns. They may, they're operating under enormous constraints of discrimination, but they have some ability to choose tactics. They can choose to engage in more nonviolent or more violent acts of resistance to white supremacy. That in turn, there's some sort of state counteraction. It may be that it's a peaceful event on both sides of the state and the protesters. There may be state repression in an event like Bloody Sunday in Selma. But in either case, the media tends to focus on rights, and that helps to grow the larger coalition for kind of an egalitarian shift in our politics. What the prediction here is that we see violence by protesters, whether the state is nonviolent, as in the case of Albany, Georgia, or fairly, sort of restrained, or in the case of Watts, there's incredible amounts of state repression and protester violence, that the media is going to focus really on issues of riots and disorder, and that helps grow the order maintenance coalition. So that's broadly the theory. And so now I'm going to show some of the results. And looking, this is an analysis that takes each county, compares it to itself over the 64, 68, and 72 presidential elections. And what I'm asking is if a county is treated, and I'll explain that in a second, by a protest, does it shift away from its sort of historical trend of voting in terms of Democratic vote share? I control for a bunch of things. I'm not going to belabor that, but controlling for a bunch of stuff, comparing a county to itself. When a county is treated, I'm saying, well, there's a certain number of participants, at least 10 participants or 10 arrests. Just subtly, I'm using two data sets here, so I'm not going to go into that, but that's why these are two different measures. If it's within 100 miles, so if there's a protest event within 100 miles of your county, you're considered treated. And if it's within 2 years, within essentially 730 days of the election, it's considered treated. So there's a kind of geographic proximity and a temporal proximity that are both driving a quote treatment. And if you're outside of that time or geographic window, you're a control. And what I find is that counties that are exposed to nonviolent protest as compared to ones that were not exposed to to nonviolent protests as compared to ones that had no protest activity, on a variety of specifications, including all counties, including just 90% white counties, including where I match sort of very similar counties, that compared to their historical trend, they vote more liberally. We see an increase, a significant increase of about 1 to 2 percentage points in the Democratic vote share. Conversely, for counties that are exposed to violent protest, again, a bunch of specifications, when we look at the number of, on one data set, if there are at least 10 participants in a protest within 100 miles in 2 years of your county, it votes more conservatively, about, again, 1 to 2 percentage points more conservatively. And if we look at this data set where I'm using arrest data, it's about, let's call it 5 to 6 percentage points more conservatively. So suggestive evidence of a differential effect of tactics, but I also want to try and get at, can we get closer to a causal, really, better way of trying to approximate something like an experiment? And here I draw on some work by two economists, Margot and Collins, who showed that you could use rainfall around the brutal, the terrible killing, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the way rainfall is thought to work here, and this has been shown across a bunch of different kinds of gatherings, is it's fairly intuitive. When there's more rainfall, people are less likely to gather outside. When there's less rainfall, people are more likely to gather outside. So Martin Luther King is assassinated April 4th. And so if we look at, take rainfall in the period following King's assassination, we might assume that places that get more rain have less protest activity. In my own archival work, I found precisely that in some of the articles. Heavy downpour dampens protest. Here's Charles Evers, brother of Medgar Evers, talking about lower turnout than expected in a protest not following King's assassination. So looking at that week immediately following King's assassination, when 95% of protests occur, I am using rainfall to predict protest activity and then protest activity to predict voting in November. And what we find is that rainfall in April is associated with about, call it an 8 to 10 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of voting for the Democratic Party in counties that are kind of geographically proximate to 137 events following King's assassination. So 95% of the protests follow that King's assassination. We might worry, well, maybe it's not just rainfall, you're picking up something like region or some other thing correlated with rainfall. And so I also do a placebo test where I look at a period before King's assassination and also a period in the week, in the latter part of April when only 5% of protests occur. And here there's no significant relationship between the rainfall estimate and voting in either of these. And so the idea is, it's this effect of rainfall predicting protests, predicting voting is only happening in 1 week in April. And so the most plausible explanation is that it's happening through the channel of violent protest activity. And so with that, I'm making what I think is a credible claim that violent protest is having a significant negative effect on Democratic vote share in the regions proximate to those events. Does that matter politically? We know elections are not just about the vote share. So I run a simulation and I look at, well, if we imagine King wasn't assassinated and some counties were not exposed to violent protests and there was a slight shift back to the Democratic Party, Humphrey wins in the modal case, 58% of the time, gaining about 275 electoral votes. Importantly, and I'll get to this in a second, the states that tip, the states that are kind of pivotal are Delaware, Illinois, Missouri, New Jersey, Ohio, right? So it's actually not the South. Nixon is often credited with winning with a Southern strategy, but in fact, if we see, it's really the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic here. George Wallace takes most of the South. Texas is already Democratic. So I think this is a kind of an interesting echo of 2016, where the pivotal states were, again, Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. Just finally on the subject of public opinion, and I have a couple more slides and then we'll wrap. We can see that if we look at these data, this is number of protesters per month on one axis, percent saying civil rights is the most important problem on another, that as protest activity kind of spikes, here's the March on Washington, we see this big increase in concern about percentage of the public saying civil rights is the most important problem. As protest activity goes down, this goes down. Then when the 64 Civil Rights Act is considered, there's a spike again. So, right? So there is an elite effect, right? So Gabriel Lenz is not wrong that elites are influencing public opinion, but Take Lee is also not wrong that there's a bottom-up effect, right? In Selma, this is really dramatic. When Bloody Sunday happens, just an incredible spike in concern about civil rights. But again, a dramatic drop-off, one more spike around the Voting Rights Act. And we see a similar pattern with concern about social control as the number of arrests in protests that are, this is historically called urban riots. As these kind of go up, we see a spike in the summer, decline in the winter, spike in the summer, decline in the winter. And that pattern goes all through this period, right up through, this is the Attica prison uprising, and that happens in September, October, a big spike. So there's plausibly a relationship, and I don't have time to show you, but protests are influencing media, is influencing public opinion. And then finally, I want to show one thing which I haven't shown before, just because we're in California and we're at UC Berkeley. I've been looking at individual polling data. That is to say, all the observations in the past have been counties and things. Here, I want to show you some individual level polling data. This is a poll from October 1965, 1,260 California adults, and people were asked a question about LA riots, right? So you could say, one thing the riots did was to bring attention to the bad conditions that exist in Negro slums, a more sympathetic reading, or it could be the police should crack down harder and faster when Negroes get out of line. So people were asked all 8 of these questions. Some of them, again, more sympathetic, some of them less sympathetic. And when you add those up, what we can see is that on the question of voting for Pat Brown, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but Watts is August of 65, Pat Brown is running for governor against Ronald Reagan in 1966. We see probability of voting for Brown, depending on how you responded to those 8 questions. If you answered more negatively, it's about a 15 percentage point, 15% of those people controlling for a bunch of things are likely to vote, self-reported likelihood of voting for Brown, up to about 75% who have a more positive interpretation, right? So just a huge shift in support for Brown as a function of attitudes about what this survey called LA riot and racial disturbances. One last question, and then I will wrap. Here, this is a survey by Lewis Harris and Associates. Just one question. Brown was lax in the way he handled Watts riots. Again, probability of voting for Brown. And what we see is that if you disagreed that Brown was lax, there's about there's about 75% of the Democrats were likely to vote, but if you agreed, about 25% chance you were going to support Brown. And interestingly, right, there's no movement in the Republican line, right? Republicans aren't that likely to vote for the Democrat. So where we see the movement is among Democrats leaving the Democratic fold. And importantly, it's not just Democrats. Blacks don't move that much. It's really this kind of, depending on which plot we're looking at, about a 50 percentage point shift is really white Democrats. And so that is, I think, what at an individual level, what we're seeing kind of nationally. I'm going to not go through all of this and just say that, broadly, we see protests are influencing politics, but the kinds of tactics employed matter. That going, just to kind of tie it back to the other panelists, right, that Nixon is running on law and order. It's the first time we have a national candidate who helps to run and win, and this helps to build a durable kind of punitive criminal justice agenda for the next 50 years. So this is not just about one election, it's about whether the lead author of the Civil Rights Act, Humphrey, wins, or the person who starts the war on drugs, Nixon, wins. And that the protests matter and the tactics matter. So elites dominate political communication, but hold no monopoly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please, everyone, please feel free to start typing your questions in the Q&A box. There's already been a few that the panelists have answered. Panelists, while we're waiting for some of, while we're waiting for those to come in, panelists, I think you should feel free to ask each other questions as well. But we do have a first question I think this one's for Omar, from Dan L. Regarding the vote decline for Pat Brown, wasn't it more white feeling about demonstrations at Berkeley than white feelings about Watts?
Well, so it's a helpful question, and certainly there are multiple things going on, but the question was specifically Brown, do you agree or disagree with how Brown handled Watts, right? So that's one of them. So there's not a lot of room for variation there, and consider it's not demonstrations at Berkeley. It's not the other question. So this is actually 2 different survey questions, right? The other one was LA riots and Negro demonstrations, right? So it's not asking about Berkeley. And I should also add that I'm finding this dynamic in lots of other contexts. So not cross-nationally, looking nationally on, so a question I get a lot about these results is, well, maybe in '68 it's the Vietnam War. Looking at Democratic voters who voted for Johnson in '64 and Nixon in '68, attitudes about unrest are predictive of whether you're going to essentially defect from the Democrats to the Republicans. Attitudes about Vietnam are not predictive. Attitudes about civil rights are not predictive. So I think, other kinds of protests certainly matter, but in the analyses where we can ask, we have fine-grained questions and we have an ability to kind of parse them, I'm not finding that in particular moments, things like anti-Vietnam protests in '68, and it may be that Berkeley free speech protests matter, but they're not being asked in those survey questions. So I think I can plausibly say that's not about Berkeley free speech.
Great, thank you for that. No other questions? I don't know if the panelists have any thoughts on the other questions on the panel they'd like to share, or questions for the other panelists. Feel free to hop in with those while we're waiting for folks in the audience to send in their questions.
I have questions. I'll just go ahead and ask. This is really for everybody, but I think Hannah and Des, your papers speak the most directly to it. I'm curious how we think about proximal contact. Direct contact or personal contact seems very clear to me. Proximal contact seems like it could vary in lots of ways. So it could be, you know, how much you know the people in your neighborhood, whether it was both proximal and direct, right? Whether you have both of those experiences. Hannah, with the proximal contact you were talking about, how close are you to that person, right? Versus, are they a distant cousin? So I wonder sort of how you think about whether those things matter, and how we should think about sort of measuring those distinctions as we get more and more people in the group who at least know somebody who has had this kind of contact, or have somebody in their neighborhood that they either know personally or just have heard the story about.
Yeah, I'm happy to go ahead and respond to that first, and Desmond, if you want to jump in, go for it. But so the way that I've sort of conceptualized and thought about proximal contact, the thing that is, so the underlying mechanism is one that you guys have really honed in on, and that is this mechanism of civic learning and the extent to which a personal or a proximal experience can really teach us about how, not just about how the system works, but about our own relationship to the system. And so within the context of that framework, the thing that is really important is the strength of the relationship. I'm not totally convinced that the character of the relationship, whether, you know, it's a distant cousin or, you know, your sibling, I'm not sure that that matters as much as, you know, the closeness of the relationship. And in some other work that I've done where I've been able to actually follow up and ask a question about not just have you had proximal contact, but how strong is your relationship with the person that you're thinking about. That is what we find, that the stronger that the relationship is, the more impactful that relationship is, the more consequential it is for a political behavioral outcomes. But that said, I think this is an area where that is just ripe for further research, both in terms of thinking about, you know, numbers of contacts. Is there a point at which your network is so saturated by people who have had these types of experiences that you then just are demobilized and withdraw? Or perhaps the nature of the way that you're relating to the state and the nature of your participation changes dramatically. And then sort of the other piece of that then is also, is there an interactive effect between your proximal relationships and the character of the neighborhood where you live, which I've not found that interactive, any kind of interactive relationship there, but I suspect that that has more to do with data than it has to do with the reality of how those things interact on the ground.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, I can imagine two stories. One is an empathy story, right? I get involved because I care about the people in my network, and I might have more resources than they do in order to engage on their behalf. And the other is I learned something about my own standing or the standing of my group. And so the other question is, do I see that person in my network as like me in some way? And so it seems like there's a clear kind of racial dynamic between friends, or a sort of similarity dynamic that would be at play there if that's the story.
Yeah, I think, like, just to respond to that really quickly, I was having a conversation with some other folks yesterday about this question, and somebody asked me something to the effect of, like, if you serve on jury duty and you're exposed to how the criminal justice system works, is that considered proximal contact? In another conversation I was having, someone asked me about the Prisons and Justice Initiative at Georgetown and Mark Howard's program, where he's bringing Georgetown students into prison and they're taking classes alongside prisoners. And is that proximal contact? And so for me, I think, you know, perhaps differently from that maybe this makes me a less good social scientist, but it makes the conceptual picture quite messy, but also what we're observing is people learning about the criminal justice system, right? Well, those Georgetown students are learning about their privileged relationship to the criminal justice system, but also through that, they may be developing a sense of injustice, and they may be becoming mobilized, and they may become advocates. We saw that happen with a lot of the students. And so I sort of see that in the bundle, I see that in the space of proximal contact, but again, that makes a conceptual mess out of the way that, you know, I've traditionally thought about it and theorized about it.
Yeah, just building off of that, I would say, you know, in my, at least for police killings, I think that there is like a significant distinction to be made between, you know, you were stopping frisk, or you know someone who's stopping frisk, and police killings, in that police killings are so rare, right? And so any effect that we're measuring, their average effects aggregated across some community, you know, most people aren't going to have known the person who was killed. Maybe you know, have seen them on the street, or maybe you saw the incident. In my research, at least looking at student outcomes, I don't find any significant difference between police killings of somebody that lived in the area and police killings of somebody that didn't live in the area. But there are these differences across race and distance or whatever. And I just want to, and I think this gets to Hannah's point about how messy this is. You know, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's a lot of correlates that go into how close you live to someone, you know, your racial similarity, your demographic similarity. And even within those, you know, finer distinctions, you know, you could like a person, you could not like a person, and whether or not they get killed by police or stopped by police, you're going to update differently based on your view of them. And I would also finally just say that, you know, again, what we measure of any of this stuff, just based on the nature of regression analysis generally, is average effects, right? And so on average, you find that people are turning out more. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who are actually demobilized by these police killings. And perhaps there are people that were never registered, and now this police killing is going to make them less likely to register or less likely to do anything else. And so I think we do want to be careful about that. But it is a conceptual mess, and it's oftentimes harder to sort of unpack these things in a single paper when we get into that level of nuance.
If I may ask a question, this one is for Angela. And so Angela, you dropped in a couple of quotes from folks who you'd interviewed. And I was just wondering in the course of your presentation, and so I was just wondering within the course of the larger book project, sort of what you were after with collecting those interviews and how they've informed the way you're relating to and thinking about the quantitative data.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so the interviews have been part of the earlier process, but also the later process. I think in the earlier process, they really informed a lot of the questions around modifying the traditional like need to belong scale by psychologists, and to sort of tease it out and assess like the right wording and whether or not, you know, they had some validity aside from a survey, right? And in sort of a survey context. I think, you know, as part of the larger book project, the qualitative work has really informed and kind of helped tease out a lot of the mechanism, which oftentimes is really kind of hard to get at with the surveys, but also with the experiments, right? And so I think that the qualitative data, the interviews have been really helpful in shedding light as to like, what are the sources of these perceptions of inclusion and exclusion? Where do they come from? Are they only coming from exclusion or inclusion that's specific to their ethnic group? Can they also have greater perceptions of inclusion based on a whole bunch of other different things? And the answer is yes, right? There are a lot of other identities that Latinos may have that also makes them feel excluded, right? For example, if they're part of the LGBTQ community, that's just one example. I have some really interesting data also on multiracials and how they sort of have navigate society in different ways, and the particular things that make them feel excluded are related to their ethnic group, but they can't seem to kind of walk past that despite the fact that they might also be half white, right? So some really interesting stuff there that, you know, has really kind of made me really think about what are these sources of perceptions of belonging and inclusion. And I think more than that, they have given me sort of a better understanding of how psychologically, this might be different, and this is different from the ways in which we've measured perceived group discrimination, right? It seems like this is a lot more psychological. It's individual in many cases. It might be tied to the group, but it has given me sort of a better sense of what's going on there.
Great. Well, we're at the top of the hour. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists for joining. This was just all really just incredibly fascinating and ambitious and interesting research. So thank you for taking the time to share it with us. And also again, thank you to the Citrin Center for helping organize this event. So we'll say goodbye to everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.